But let's talk about question number one. Stated, it says this: there's a strange verse found only in Mark's Gospel, Mark 14, 51 and 52. Please explain why this verse is in the text. That's pretty interesting, isn't it? First thing we need to do is we need to go to Mark 14, 51 and 52. Listen to what it says. And there followed him a certain young man, having a linen cloth cast about his naked body. Note this. And the young man laid hands on him. And he left the linen cloth and fled from them naked. There you go. There's the passage. Now the questioner says, what in the world is this verse doing in the pages of the New Testament? This is the weirdest verse I've ever seen in my life. Let's go back and let's look at the background of this particular verse first. Jesus Christ is in the Garden of Gethsemane, and the mob has entered into the garden. You know the mob? They came with their staves and their lanterns, and they're led by Judas in order to arrest Jesus Christ. That's in verse 43 of Mark 14. Notice what the Bible says. And they laid hands on him, that's Jesus, and took him. Mark 14, verse 46. One of the disciples in verse 47, we know who he is. He's not named in Mark's Gospel, but we know him to be Peter. Drew his sword, did he not? Struck the servant of the high priest's right ear by the name of Malchus, cutting off his ear. You see, Peter was ready to defend the Christ right there in the Garden of Gethsemane. We also know that Jesus told him to put his sword up, and he touched the ear of Malchus and healed him, didn't he? Jesus refused to allow his disciples to defend him that night. Thus we read verse 50, and all the disciples forsook him and fled. And it is at that point that we come to verse 51, and we learn that there was another person in the garden. The Bible simply refers to him as a certain young man. What's interesting is there have been many suggestions as to who this young man is, because the Bible doesn't name him. Matthew, Luke, and John give us no indication about this individual's presence whatsoever. So who is he? When you read Barnes' notes, Albert Barnes says that this could have possibly been the keeper of the garden. A young man that was there, he was aroused by the crowd, and because of that, he grabs a linen cloth, wraps it about himself, and goes out to see what's transpiring on that occasion. Sounds logical enough, doesn't it? That is not the prevailing view, folks. There is another statement made in the text that we need to get hold of, and it says this: that certain young man followed him. Notice how the text reads, and there followed him a certain young man. The him there being Jesus Christ. Folks, that would not have been the gardener, the keeper of the garden, who was asleep. This young man was there for a purpose. He was there for a reason. He was there because Jesus was there. So again, we ask the question, who is this individual? And the most common view is that this was none other than John Mark himself. Notice what Robertson said in his comments on this verse. This incident alone in Mark. It is usually supposed that Mark himself, son of Mary, Acts 12, verse 12, in whose house they had probably observed the Passover meal, had followed Jesus and the apostles to the garden. It is a lifelike touch quite in keeping with such a situation. Who wrote the Gospel of Mark, folks? It was John Mark. And he's the only individual who makes mention of this person in the garden. How did he know this person was there? Because it was he who was there. Interesting, isn't it? John Mark has a very close relationship with one of the apostles. And it's the Apostle Peter. You remember when Peter was arrested, they were going to kill him following the Sabbath day, and an angel comes and frees him from that prison. And Peter goes to a woman's house by the name of Mary. He knocks on the door, a little servant girl by the name of Rhoda. She runs out, she sees it's Peter, and rather than let him in, she goes back in and says, "Peter's out there." Finally, they bring Peter in. Folks, the home into which he is brought is a woman by the name of Mary. And Mary is the mother of John Mark. In other words, Peter, after his release, went to the home of John Mark. In Peter's first epistle, in chapter 5, verse 13, he refers to John Mark as my son. Most of the time when those words are used, they indicate that the older individual, being Peter, was the one who had converted this individual to Christianity. So Peter possibly had taught John Mark the gospel of Jesus Christ and had immersed him for the forgiveness of his sins, and had become his mentor, his teacher of the gospel of Jesus Christ. It is thought that because of this very close relationship with Peter, that John Mark had the capabilities to write an entire gospel about the life of Christ. You see, he had heard firsthand information, firsthand accounts about Jesus from this apostle who was his mentor, who was his teacher, who had taught him all that he had learned about the Son of the living God. Why is this verse in the Bible? Number one, to reveal to us a fact that was unknown even to the other three gospel writers. John Mark wanted individuals to know, I was there in the garden as well. When those apostles fled into that garden with Jesus, I was right there with them. If the Passover meal had been eaten in his house, when he heard them leave, he may have very quickly grabbed a linen cloth, wrap it about him, and go to see what's going to transpire for the rest of this evening. Notice also it may be in the biblical text in order to give us an indication as to who the writer of this gospel is. None other than John Mark himself. Now, I don't know about you, but I got a lot of questions about this young guy, don't you? One is this: why in the world is he so scantily clad? The Bible says he did what? Having a linen cloth cast about his naked body. When they grabbed that cloth, guess what? He fled from the garden naked. Don't you have some more clothes, John Mark? What's the deal here? How about this question? How was he spotted and almost caught? He was so well hidden that the other apostles didn't even know he was there. And yet now when the mob comes into the garden, he's exposed and they lay hands on him, grab his garment, and he flees from them naked. How in the world did they find you, John Mark? I'd also like to ask him, where did he go after he left the garden? Can you imagine him running home, knocking on the door, and his mama answering, he got nothing on? Where you been, boy? Folks, none of those questions will ever be answered in this life. We'll have to die, go find John Mark in heaven, and ask him a few questions. First one is this: was that really you? Because if it wasn't, he needs to tell us who it is, doesn't he? Because he's the only one who mentions this young man.